Great. Does anyone want to lead us into, well, I guess we have chapter 4 and 5 today. Short little chapter 4, though. You know, on chapter 4, on the Neokantian.
Sorry, Matt. I did actually something. This is actually a follow-up from last week with Lorenzo and Hegel. There's some very interesting lectures in 202, one specifically on Hegel and Schopenhauer, which you might like to look at. He mentions sort of like the political aspects of why Western secret brotherhoods had to suppress Hegelian thinking. So you might want to look into that, because that's like your area of interest, I believe.
Yeah. Sorry, you said in 202?
202, the fourth or the fifth lecture series there. I'll look it up whilst we're talking. I can send you a direct link, but you might find it interesting. Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry for interrupting there, Matt.
That's all right. I was just thinking, after reading chapter 4 on the Neokantians and the curious position, as Steiner refers to it, that the Neokantians found themselves in, both saying that our understanding of nature is limited by our own organization, even while that same understanding is used to explain away our organization, our consciousness. And it reminded me a bit of Richard Tarnas in his epilogue to Passion of the Western Mind. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that text. He talks about the post-Copernican double bind in the epilogue, and I'll share a link to an online post of that entire epilogue. And it's exactly this situation that Steiner is trying to articulate. And I think indeed Rick was influenced by Steiner in his articulation of this. I'll share that for you all to read on your own later. But he basically talks about the double bind creating this cognitive dissonance that leads to the increasingly schizophrenic contemporary condition that we find ourselves in intellectually, both feeling empowered by the scientific knowledge and technological control that knowledge has afforded us, but also profoundly erased or demoted in our sense of importance as human beings by that very knowledge and power. So check that out later if you're interested to see the parallels.
There was one thing that I could add to do with chapter 4. That lots of interesting points in there. I think two key ones for me is he is giving more background than he does in the Philosophy of Freedom on this idea that you've got two components of reality, observation and the thinking, and that they in themselves like make this whole. And that's really crystallizing in this chapter. I think already in the previous chapter it was becoming obvious, but here he talks about that point a lot more when he starts talking about Otto Liebmann and two points of origin and two sources of certainty. So I think that's interesting. Actually, I said 2 points. I'm going to mention 3 points because I've just, for some reason, I've highlighted Will-o'-the-Wisps, and it's particularly because of Goethe's fairy tale. That the Will-o'-the-Wisps, they have quite an important role in that fairy tale, which is also an interesting take on so like what's happening in the soul as we develop it. That these what is the nature of these will-o'-the-wisps there. So it's one of those words that you've heard used occasionally, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's a common word, and it's even vaguer in its meaning, but when you see him using it in this context, and then knowing that this is the usual translation they give for these figures in Lichtenbilder, I think they're called, but whatever, in Goethe's fairy tale, that Irrlichter, that's what it is, it's Irrlichter. They it adds another dimension to reading the fairy tale, or about these characters in the fairy tale. And then the final point, which I think is particularly relevant to this whole book, is where we've got, who is it who says this? It's isn't it? Is it? It's Wale, Richard Wale, saying that may the age begin when people will say, once was philosophy. So here we've got another philosopher like predicting the end of philosophy, which I think is quite interesting in the context of this whole book.
Yeah. I'm forgetting who it was. I was just reading an article about prospects for peace in our world today, and someone was arguing for a liberal, political liberal was arguing for a world without worldviews, and that this would be an ideal situation. And it struck me a strange thing to hope for. But it stems from this, this same, as Steiner ends chapter 4, the lack of confidence with respect to knowledge, that begins with Kant. Though Kant was still so sure of mathematics, and in particular Euclidean geometry, and that it just sort of naturally mapped onto the nature of space. And when that turned out not to be true, that there were all these non-Euclidean geometries, I think it sent what for Kant was still rooted in a kind of necessary and universal form of knowledge, whereby our thinking, our mathematical thinking, corresponded to nature. Once that rug was pulled out, it leads straight to postmodernism, relativism, and so on.
Can I chime in?
Sure.
Okay. This is very challenging for me. I like these two chapters. I feel like I've sort of can enter into the weave of this book better than I could. And I followed his arguments extremely well. And I think he's also showing where he's showing his cards a little bit. He's been very poker faced, being fair to everybody, but I can tell now he has a very biting wit, and he does tend to dig a little bit deeper than he usually does into people that he obviously disagrees with. And so I hope we see more of that in the rest of the book. Last time, I think Lorenzo mentioned paraconsistent logic. So I did a little bit of thinking on that. I also found, I quoted an author last time, a philosopher last time, whose name I couldn't remember. I remember it now. His name is Marcus Gabriel. And he's written a book called Why the World Does Not Exist. And I just want to, and also I think this ties into this text and a question that I posed last time, and that is, when monism versus dualism, what do we want to have happen? Okay, which is a very ambitious question, because what kind of we is that we when we want to have something happen? I would say it's a very coherent we. But I'm also I'm using the question to invite an imaginal response. So I'm just quoting him very briefly. He says, monism is false and dualism is unjustified. On account of this, by virtue of a simple process of elimination, only pluralism is left, which, however, we must radically modernize. This is his preference. It's not necessarily mine. I'm for pluralism, but I don't know about modern pluralism. Doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, he also says at the end of this chapter, I like this. He says, all worldviews are false because they assume that there is a world about which we can have a view. As we will see, we can dispense with the world without giving up on science. In fact, we must defend ourselves against the unreasonable demand of having to explain everything, an unreasonable demand which nothing and no one can fulfill. So his idea here is the world is not in the world. The world is outside of the world, but there can't be anything outside of the world. It's a performative contradiction. So no one can know that world. And if you look at a paraconsistent logic, we would have an either or within a circle, right? Either or is in the circle. Both and would contain that. And my question was, what about neither nor? Where do you put neither nor? And I think this is where a lot of logicians have food fights, because if you go back to Nagarjuna, he was making these paraconsistent arguments. Our friend Timothy Morton, of course, says, stay away from neither nor. That's nihilism. It's dangerous. So I'm bringing that up because Lorenzo brought that up. And I think Graham Priest is the philosopher who's done a lot on paraconsistent logic. But I don't think these are irrelevant. What's the subset of what? It's sort of like the question of, well, whereabouts is the world? Does the world have a size or a shape? How could anyone know the world? Because you can't get outside of the world. This is, I think, what Wittgenstein was trying to deconstruct. So I'm bringing all this up because what I would like to have happen, I can only speak for myself, is I would like to co-create a pluralism, but what kind of a pluralism? And I would like this is pretty way out there, I admit, but a neo-archaic pluralism, which would be very friendly to Gebser's idea that, and I think this is I think a feature of the times that he was working in. We're in the midst of that. Well, it's what Gebser calls the deficient rational, or maybe called it the deficient mental. But at any rate, it says we're the top of the pyramid, the rational, and we've transcended those previous primitive stages. Meanwhile, we know Gebser, and I think it was Bellows. Is it Bellows who wrote that famous book on religion, The Axial Age? The rational mind never appears in any society before the mythical and the magical, so it's the rational mind rides piggyback on the mythical, magical, and the archaic, and those structures that Gebser meticulously documents through art and through music and through many other ways through archaeology. They're still here. They don't go away. And I think this is where what the kind of pluralism I would hope for, it's not a modernist pluralism. I doubt it. That's what this Marcus Gabriel was talking about. Because it seems to me that modernism actually has rejected to some extent those previous structures and has made claims about a universal character of where the scientific mind works, which is a very quantifying mind, and but a new kind of science would appreciate this complexity, and that there are different levels, and that the levels previous to the deficient rational are still operative, and a healthy rational mind would recognize that. So we would have what Gebser calls an efficient rationality. And so we were right at the cusp, I believe, he believed, of what he was calling the integral age, which many of us are probably familiar with from the work of Ken Wilber and others. So I'm just sharing this with you guys in a kind of open frame for myself as I enter into the weave of Steiner's very complex history. And I think he was, I believe, right at that cusp and probably very, very aware of the archaic, the magical, the mythical, and that they are very much alive in our current world. And the more and more we get into a deficient rational phase and try to quantify everything, the more deeper into shit we get. So also one more thing. I met one time on the astral a friend that had died, someone that I loved very dearly and had a very intense relationship with. And I asked him, are you, oh, did I black out? Can you hear me? He says, I asked him an either or question, which I recognize now was a bad question. I said, are you real or are you just my imagination? That's a very modernist orientation. This was 40 years ago when this happened. But now I would realize, well, and he didn't answer me. He did something else, but he didn't answer that question. Now I would realize, yes, he is real and he is also my imagination. And I would go along with Nagarjuna and say, well, yes, he is real and he is my imagination, and he's neither real nor is he my imagination. So I can play around with those paraconsistent logics because I think that becomes a very useful skill as we get bombarded, as we are every day, with all kinds of mixed messages coming from many different levels and from many different structures, consciousness structures. So thank you for this is a bit improvised and a little sloppy, but it helps me to rehearse it in a public forum like this. So thank you for your patience. I hope that was of use.
Yeah, I have so much to say in response. I'm going to let Lorenzo go first since you were bringing up his paraconsistent logics discussion last time, and then I'll share some thoughts too. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I have something for John and for Angus too. I will go with John first. Do you know John Deleuze works on a cinema? I cannot hear you.
I have them on my shelf. I've dipped into them, especially the parts on Charles Saunders Peirce, because he writes on Peirce a lot. I would love another study group. Maybe we could start that up because I'd love to read those 2 volumes, but I have to see all the movies that he talks about first, and I don't know half of them or even a third of them.
So yeah, there's a part when Deleuze talks about the image pulsion, the drive image, what we call pulsione in psychoanalytic terms. I think it's called drive in English. And there is, he talks about different kinds of images. And when you were talking about a neo-archaic pluralism, the idea of drive image came to me. This is very just intuitive. I don't want now to go too much into it because it would be too long and maybe misleading, but it's just food for thought for you. If maybe you can find the connection I'm talking about. And then I agree with Angus that the passage from Richard Wale is one of the most interesting bits of the last 2 chapters. And I'm not sure if I'm reading correctly Steiner here, but he seems to me to be saying that Wale had the chance to really have a rational argument, a logical argument to explain the interaction between subject and object and how we act on reality with our very own perception, but that he couldn't go there because he took for granted as an assumption that mind could not modify reality. So there is this little passage, this mind would have to exert its own energy to produce order in the occurrences, but then it would be the mind itself that had introduced that order into nature. If the mind makes a statement about the essence of the occurrences, it derives this not from the things, but from itself. This it could only do if it admitted that in its own activity something essential could go on. The assumption would have to be made that the mind's judgment could have significance also for things. This passage, I think Steiner is saying something that he believes and that Wahler was taking as an absurd, but he's actually taking it up and showing it as the real point and what he thinks more interesting. What do you think about that? Thanks.
Let me think about that. Matt wants to say something, and I'll prep an answer for that, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I was, asking to you, but to everybody, of course. Did you find the passage? Sorry, I didn't say where it came from. It's yeah, okay. By the end of chapter 4, 2 pages before the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify a few things that John shared. First of all, the phenomenologist, I think it's Gabriel Marcel, in his book, what was it called? 1949. It was like Being and Having, I think. He says a few things that I wanted to share that I think are especially relevant to the anthroposophical path forward that Steiner will be laying out for us in a few chapters here. So Marcel says, he's distinguishing a problem from a mystery. And he says, a problem is something which I meet, which I find completely before me, but which I can therefore lay siege to and reduce. But a mystery is something in which I am myself involved, and it can therefore only be thought of as a sphere where the distinction between what is in me and what is before me loses its meaning and initial validity. And then later in the same book, he's different book actually. He says, he follows up on this same issue though. He says, when I am dealing with a problem, I am trying to discover a solution that can become common property, that consequently can, at least in theory, be rediscovered by anybody at all. But this idea of a validity for anybody at all, or of a thinking in general, has less and less application the more deeply one penetrates into the inner courts of philosophy. So this general thinking that he's talking about, I think we could equate more with the sort of Hegelian mode of thought. And the inner courts of philosophy, I think, where he's gesturing towards this deeper penetration, I think has something to do with the individual and our own individual freedom in discovering a concrete living thinking for ourselves, right? Which is available to anybody, but a sort of generic, there's no way for that insight of free individual living thinking to be given to somebody else in the form of a general formula or something, right? You need to discover it for yourself. So Marcel is awesome. Glad you're reading that, John. And then this question of paraconsistent logics and the neither nor, which I think you had as the outermost, most encompassing circle, right?
I made that up. I don't know. A lot of people would say there is no neither nor. I think Timothy Morton is very suspicious of that. But I asked a logician friend if either or is a subset of both and, where's neither nor? And she says, I don't know.
That's a good answer. Well, it reminded me of negative theology or apophatic theology, which, goes back to Gregory of Nyssa. And I've just been revisiting this material, Gregory of Nyssa and Pseudo-Dionysius, and then Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century. And this neither nor comes through in, Arjuna scooped everyone. He was, 2nd century, but Gregory of Nyssa was 3rd century, 4th century. So, but Pseudo-Dionysius was 5th or 6th century, influenced by Gregory of Nyssa. He says in his book, Mystical Theology, God falls neither within the predicate of non-being nor of being. And all of these guys are inheriting Plato and the dialogue Parmenides, who refers to the one beyond being, because you can't enumerate the one, because that would make it then one among the many. Plotinus picks up on this point, and Steiner highlights it, where one goes beyond the rational intellect to commune with or identify themselves with this one in a sort of mystical feeling. Steiner wants us to bring a scientific consciousness to this mystical feeling, where Plotinus sort of leaves us off, but nonetheless, I think it's an interesting marker in the evolution of consciousness that these early thinkers, these negative theologians and Neoplatonists, had penetrated into this insight, but only through mystical feeling. And I think Steiner's calling us to do so, to bring our full consciousness into this mystery, right? So yeah,
without getting lost in the mystery. I mean,
right.
there is I think an integral impulse is to deconstruct and then reconstruct something, because you just can't float in the void. You'll get hit
Right.
by the bus, or a terrible president will become elected and you'll
Right.
really be in trouble. So I think these are very political questions too that we're bringing to the table that the monastic traditions did not have to ask, really, because they were sort of behind closed walls. Although the audience that they had to write for was the Inquisition, so they had to be very, very careful in later centuries.
Of course.
Meister Eckhart and Marie Perret and a lot of people were. He didn't burn at the stake, she did, but he would have if he'd lived long enough, I'm sure. So anyway, those are things to remember about the different kinds of suppression that can happen. And because we're being suppressed today, even as we speak. So, but
yeah,
I think it's like, well, what are we going to do with all of this information? How do we turn it into knowledge? And I think we're not there yet. We're just still being bombarded by information that's not been integrated or shaped or qualified. So anyway,
yeah,
so thank you for that.
Kusta was writing in the mid 1400s, and he scooped Copernicus with his understanding of the Earth as moving, which is an insight he came to just by following the thread of what an infinite God would imply for the cosmos, the creation, which couldn't be separate from an infinite God, because that would limit God's infinity. But Kusta also had this vision of an omnicentric universe, which brings me back to your point about pluralism and this sense of a higher pluralism, if you will, not relativism, but a higher pluralism. And again, footnotes to Plato, right? In that same dialogue I mentioned, the Parmenides, Plato talks about unity itself, or the one, being parceled out by being, right? And so it's not only many, but indefinitely numerous, he says in Parmenides. And so in other words, the one, being infinite, is equally present in each of the many, right? And I mean, this is very much a kind of Whiteheadian ontology that I'm deep into. But anyways, hopefully food for thought to continue this inquiry. Lorenzo, is your hand back up?
Yeah, I wanted to draw a distinction between paraconsistent logics, as I understand them, and apophaticism and let's say skepticism. The difference, I think, is that even if in paraconsistent logics you admit contradictions, and so you can say that God is man and divine at the same time, so is mortal and immortal at the same time. It does so with the distinction that the subject that is A and B at the same time is A and B in different ways. That is, you got the theology of the Trinity, of the three persons, because of that. God is different in its part, even contradictory, but it is that in different ways. So it's a way to isolate, let's say, the contradictions. One might think that then you're back at point one, because you're just having as the smaller in let's say logical atoms the ways in which a subject is or isn't something. So one thinks we are back to the principle of non-contradiction, but it's not like that, because in paraconsistent logics, what becomes the foundation are not longer objects but qualities. Since you admit, okay, the same object can be white and black, white and not white, but it is white and not white in different ways. What the fundamental ontology then becomes is qualities. We could say on a linguistic level that it's an ontology based on adjectives instead of substantives. And what is crucial about qualities is that they are continuous, they have gradation, and that this gradation can be projected onto a line which where its ends coincides, what Bruno called the coincidence of opposites, or the coincidentia oppositorum. And this is very different from what we get with objects. So the difference between, I'd like to be more subtle, not to precipitate let's say paraconsistent logics back into apophaticism and to a way of skepticism in the end. But it is a way of knowledge, but it is nonetheless different from usual logic.
Go ahead, Angus.
Yeah. I'm going to play with John's metaphor to talk about Lorenzo's question, which I just think is a general observation about Steiner and how he writes about philosophy. So John says Steiner doesn't show his cards. Absolutely right. Why doesn't he? Again, so like several answers on that question. If we look at like his comments on the philosophy of freedom, and I think they're applicable for the riddles of philosophy here as well. He says this isn't like reading a normal book. You have to work through it. You can't just accept things that you like, and it's like I make a statement and you agree with it or disagree with it. He's continually like presenting us with philosophical problems, which he's not guiding us on how to resolve that particular problem at that particular time. And I'm going to look at Vale's example as a concrete example here in a second. What he does is he says, this is how they think, and he leaves it at that. And if you can't resolve that, if we can't resolve it as individuals, then we've got some work to do. Just like if we can't resolve a mathematical problem because we haven't got the basics of maths in place, we have to go back, and only through our own conviction, not because of a belief in Steiner, but through the own conviction of the clarity of our rationale, should we accept what Steiner is saying. And what he doesn't do is he doesn't serve us answers. Or he does, but he also gives us the answers of everybody else in there. So it's very easy, and we've noticed this when we're reading this book. Who's speaking here? Is it Steiner, or is it sort of like one of the philosophers he's referring to? And I think it's a very conscious process. He's taught specifically about it in the Philosophy of Freedom, and I think this is what's going on here. So let's look at this example that Lorenzo brought up. I'll just read what I think is the key phrase in here, and then pull it apart a little bit. So it's after where he talks about the book, The Whole of Philosophy and its End in 1894. And the specific sentence is, if the mind makes a statement about the essence of the occurrences, it derives this not from the thing, but from itself. Now, this is Vale's perspective. It's we make it all up in our mind. There's no relevance to reality. That doesn't mean that's what Steiner's point is. We've got to battle with that sentence there and then. And if we can defeat that then we know why Vale is wrong. But Steiner's not going to serve us the answer. So how do we defeat that there? In the Philosophy of Freedom, it's described to us, and I say it's described to us, but this is actually how we also experience thinking, is that thinking is like when a concept is born in us, it's because we're not there. This isn't something that we have invented. It is something that has been born. It's like in the act of observation. And if you can bring that thought to bear on that particular sentence, you know why Steiner thinks Vale is wrong, but Steiner won't spell it out to you. So there's a good example that you brought up there, Lorenzo, really good example of how difficult it is to read Steiner, because often when we read books, we just read through. We don't critically analyze like each sentence and try to understand it, and then sort of like fight against that sentence because we're trying to read through the book. But that's what Steiner says you should not do with the Philosophy of Freedom, and I think that's equally valid. It's been valid throughout all of this book, but especially as we move into the modern thinkers, because they're battling with sort of like the possibly erroneous preconceptions that we have about thinking.
Yeah, it reminds me of the sentiment that Steiner conveys in his book. I think it's in Human and Cosmic Thought, where he talks about the 12 worldviews, and basically says that each of these views has a part of the truth, but every worldview becomes false as soon as it claims to be the whole of the truth. And we need to gain that flexibility to enter into all of the views, to see the world from their perspective, and sort of complete the whole circuit of views. And Steiner will eventually privilege a form of higher realism, which he associates with Goethe. But this pluralism, in some sense, that Steiner's affirming here reminds me, it's a pluralism with a subtler monism. Actually, Deleuze and Guattari somewhere talk about this secret formula, pluralism equals monism, where there's a pluralism, but it also there's an integration of the many by a higher unified perspective. And this reminds me a lot of what Schelling does in his late philosophy of mythology, where he looks at the history of myth, what he calls the mythological process, moving through different places and different times, different local gods and goddesses and so on. And he says that this process is true so long as you remain in process and don't become fixed at any point. And of course, for Schelling, it culminates in this transition from myth to history through the incarnation. But this mythological process is Schelling's way of sort of folding the pagan traditions into a continuous evolutionary stream with Christianity, it's this kind of inclusivist position that allows you to see the partial truth of each stop along the way that only becomes false if you become arrested there, right? And you know, in our context, I think whether or not we can be pluralistic and still affirm the kind of Christocentrism that Schelling put forward, and you know, Steiner puts forward his own form of it, but it almost seems like when Steiner talks about institutionalized Christianity, he very much wants to distance his vision of the Christ being from what gets discussed and worshipped in that various institutional contexts, various forms of Christianity now. And so I almost wonder if there's a kind of, in our day and age, if it might be a kind of upaya or skillful means to not insist upon a particular name for this being, but to remain open to different names that it could be given appropriately. I don't know, just a thought thrown into the mix there. Jeff, I see your hand up. Jeff
I have a
Pointer.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Let me
Either Jeff. Go ahead.
So, Jeff, I'm sorry, Jeff. Did you want to go? Okay.
You first. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Matt, I have a question about human and cosmic thought, and I know you and Robert took that on some, and I'm wondering about the thing that's not mentioned, which is the 7 moods, and what their relationship is to the worldviews. And this is relevant to this conversation, I think, because he goes through this whole process of dealing with the necessity of worldviews in a certain sense, or maybe not a necessity of the worldview, but the need for people to argue one. And he seems to be suggesting in this evolution of consciousness that there was an evolution of a soul that is configured such that it can become participatory in reality in the Owen Barfieldian sense, right, of the final participation. And that at the end of the last chapter, he brings back up the notion, I forget who it was, of dependence and independence. That is, that beings that are self-determined, essentially, and nature that is, or reality that is dependent upon other things for its existence. And he does slip in his own thing there at the end of the previous chapter when he says that we create a subjective experience through the self-conscious ego, and that subjectivity is key to the covalent, or let's say shared mutual creation of something that is created independently. And then when we do that, then we transcend pluralism and worldviews and that sort of thing, and we enter into this is the problem of our time, right? Is we enter into the absolute separation between individual knowledge and collective intelligence. And you brought up Christ, so I guess I'll jump in there on that one too. His Christology is it's a phenomenology of Christ. So it's an experience, and it's a being that is living in the earth, and is an experience that is what Stein and Gaffney are talking about right now is unicity and multiplicity. And that a perception for you gained in mutuality is a perception for all of humankind in a certain sense. And that's a worldview that is brought perception and conception together as a shared perception. I think what I'm saying coheres and goes with the question of what is the relationship between the moods of the soul and the worldviews, and feeling as the key, I think, somehow to this existential mystery of our moment.
I mean, yeah, great question. Robert and I didn't try to tackle the seven moods. We had enough on our hands trying to adequately characterize all 12 of these worldviews, some of which I completely disagree with. So, but yeah, it's like the seven planets, right? From Moon on out. I can't remember them all exactly now, but I'm reminded again of something Gregory of Nyssa said about the implications for the idea in Genesis that the human being is created in the image of God, and if God is this unknowable, luminous darkness, as he put it, what does that say about the image of God in the human soul? And Nyssa ends up saying that no one is in a position to know their own soul. He's writing in the 3rd or 4th century, and if we go back several chapters, we remember the religious feelings and whatnot that Steiner was talking about here, leaving the intellect, immersing oneself in this sort of religious feeling, right? A super important moment in the history of consciousness. But Nyssa says, who among us can claim to know his own soul? It is as if within us a crowd of souls is gathered, right? And so we are each one of us, many, and not only do we each contain, at least in potentia, all of these worldviews, but many moods as well. And I think, Steiner's trying to orient us and give us this map, and to say, like, this too is human. Like, it's all in us, and we need to develop the strength of soul to identify with all the moods, to identify with all the worldviews without becoming dominated by or ideologically fixated on just one. And that's a very difficult task, so important today. So I think that's the best I can do. It's a good question, though. I have to write a second review of that Mario Betti's book to get into the moods. I think he just barely touches on the moods himself, so it's work yet to be done.
It's understandable that that would be the mysterious part of it, right? I mean, we can all sort of dial in on worldviews and argue with them at the very least, but feelings underlying are revealing in a different way, perhaps. And also, I'm going to suggest now that Steiner's notion of the 7 life processes are connected with the 7 moods, and that we're talking about, at this time in this book, we're talking about a disconnected soul, a soul that's disconnected both from the spiritual world and from the physical world. Ironically, right? Because it's supposed to be giving us nature, and in fact, it's alienating our feeling for nature. In order for the soul to be independent and become a vessel for what? But to become a vessel for a transformed feeling life or something like that as a cognitive capacity.
Yeah. You're reminding me of another figure in this negative theology lineage, an anonymous author from the 14th century who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing. And he says, I mean, maybe it was a she. They say that this no-thingness, this divine no-thingness, is perhaps better felt than seen. So just to amplify what you're saying about the feeling dimension here. The other Jeff, do you want to go now? And then I see Angus has his hand again. You're still muted, I think.
I clicked the put my hand down button and thought I was unmuting myself. Yeah, I want to put together something that Angus said with something that Matt said, and turn it into a question and see if it's an easy question for someone to answer. Yeah, Angus, you were talking about the the method of Steiner, both in Philosophy of Freedom and in this book as well, of not spoon feeding the reader the answers. He leaves that for you to do for yourself, which is a necessary part of his method. And earlier, Matt, you were quoting, forget the name of that phenomenologist who differentiated problems from mysteries.
Gabriel Marcel.
Yeah. And you said, you said that he said that like the way he defined a problem, it was essentially something for which you can discover a solution to, right? Anyway, the way you said it it sounded to me, my definition of what science is, something that has a method and its results, which all can be public, anyone can access it. So my question of all that is, if that's clearly, if a problem is science, is according to that definition, then what is a mystery? What is that opposite?
I'm not following exactly. If a problem has a scientific solution, then can a mystery be approached scientifically?
This basic polarity. If he's what's the difference between a problem and a mystery? Mm-hmm. And I know half of the answer. I know his definition of problem is the scientific method. So what would he be saying a mystery is?
Anything that involves us, anything that we can't put outside of ourselves and sort of observe and break it into its parts and analyze and so on. I think what he's referring to as this mystery that implicates ourselves is what Steiner's trying to approach with spiritual science, which would be distinct from at least a materialistic kind of natural science, which holds the world at arm's length and, as it were, forgets the self, forgets our own involvement. And so, Marcel's only bringing us so far. And for him, kind of like Plotinus, who's saying, look, this self-implicating unity whereby we are involved in that which we are trying to know in the world is a mystery. And he just wants to leave it at that. And Steiner's saying, yes, and let's step through that threshold and see what's on the other side. That's how I understand it. So Marcel's a great example of a phenomenologist in the 20th century who's getting right up against that barrier and acknowledging its mysterious nature, using the grasp of the mystery to push against any reduction of human consciousness, but yet not being able to say anything more about it. You're next, Angus. Go ahead. And then I see Jonathan and Alex. Still muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
Take us into chapter 5. Dühring, I think he's a really good example of what just building on the idea that I was talking about, how he presents his work, how he spoon feeds us or doesn't spoon feed us. I think Jeff used the phrase, he slips in things, and this is a wonderful example of how he slips in ideas. He's talking about Dühring, who's sort of like he's the ultimate representative of the mathematical worldview. So he presents us his thoughts, but then he also presents us with some of the stranger things that Dühring says about how imagination is something real, and because plants imagine things. And I think this is a good example of how he is really working very consciously with us, because he's saying that Dühring is really onto something. Despite his mathematical nature, there's another part of his soul, another part of his thinking that's sort of like saying, but we've got this imagination thing, but I've got to stay true to my principles. So I've got to find an example of it out in nature. And in that sense, sort of like he leads us into sort of like the imagination aspect, which I think is very often how he works these things. He exemplifies the thinking of that worldview, And then he'll take the same author and so like say they present some sort of curious ideas, but if you know quite a bit of Steiner, you'll recognize that he's not mentioning that by chance. It's because it's an essential part of sort of like anthroposophical thinking. Sorry, I'm going to. I'm just wondering which one to pick up on here. This idea of breaking through that you were talking about, Matt. I think it was in 214. I was reading this so like recently. Steiner, so like he gives us this exercise. He says we usually think of ourselves as the subject and the world as the object. And he says that's like what you've got to battle with. It's like a good exercise that he recommends is imagine yourself being the object and what is that subject. And that also is like this is one of these ways he uses to get us to try and transcend ourselves. What is that being that is thinking into us? Might it even be anthroposophia, if so like we're really in tune with her? Who knows?
Yeah, I like that. It reminds me of Fichte's exercises where he asked his students to stare at the wall and then stare at the one staring at the wall and so on. Yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, staring at the wall. But it's very interesting to listen to today, because we've sort of spoken a lot about philosophy really, and there's something which it's hard to touch on, but it's really being tackled in these latest chapters, which is that challenge to philosophy, which is natural science. And it's kind of hard to talk about it because we can only really talk about it conceptually in a forum like this, because we're not sort of practicing the science. It'd be very difficult, time consuming to do that. But this is the challenge. It's like it's out there, and so we can grasp it. And as Angus was pointing out, the clues of where we need to go are everywhere, and it's not kind of like a direction that somebody's trying to lead us towards as a kind of just a good idea or something. But the way it's being presented is it's kind of like all of these people we're hearing about are struggling with the same thing, and they're all sort of providing hints of where we're going and what the possibilities are. But it seems that 100 years later we still haven't got that much further with it. I imagine if this was if the sort of supplement to this was written now, we'd really be sort of reiterating all of these views, perhaps in more sophisticated ways. The main difference being the kind of the AI, so that we'll be actually throwing our kind of general thinking outside ourselves and embodying it outside ourselves. But that's still going to leave some sort of mystery inside us. And it seems the hints to me seems to be that the mystery and the thing we can grapple with have to come together, I think it's going to have to be something to do with life. Living thinking was mentioned, something whereby the human being actually begins to, if God isn't just all these atoms and bits around, there's something more there. And our next sort of point of contact with it could be life. So if we actually start to experience life in ourselves, in our consciously, so it has to be some form of thinking type thing, because it needs to be conscious, but at the same time it needs to be an immediate phenomenal experience that can be faced scientifically. So as at once a mystery and also a scientifically approachable phenomena.
Yeah, Just before you share, Alex, I just want to say that, Jonathan, I think Steiner tells us why we haven't made much progress at the very end of chapter 5, where he talks about the wealth of detailed knowledge, of scientific knowledge, making it difficult to reconstruct fundamental philosophical thoughts. He says the thread that led from the scientific knowledge of facts to a satisfactory total conception of the world was gradually lost in the general consciousness. A certain perplexity took hold of many. This was happening in the 19th century. It's even more true today. And it's not only that, those of a philosophical bent who want a world conception struggle to bring all the scientific. It's not just that philosophers struggle to bring the scientific facts together. Science itself, like physics itself, can't even bring together quantum and relativity theories, right? So everything's just gotten so fragmented that I think we're in dire need of the kind of living, thinking, this more intimate connection to ourselves. And the idea of AI being the externalization of general thought is a really interesting idea that I think is it's less terrifying to think of it that way than other possible scenarios for where AI will head in the future. But Alex, go ahead, bring us home.
Yeah, I was reflecting a little bit on how many of the topics that all of you have brought in this evening, they feel relevant to me a bit on how, at least here in Sweden, the anthroposophical movement has been struggling, and it has been a little bit in decline. There's many businesses and initiatives that have been forced to close. One thing that I have observed, and for me it has been, for example, the work of John Gebser that I have read just a little bit about, but it still has been quite helpful to understand and get some perspective on anthroposophy. But one thing that I see is that somehow there's a lot of projection from the outside on the anthroposophical movement, that it has still a sort of it's in a way, and it has a religious aspect to it, if you think about it in Gebser terms. So it's very easy for rationalists, groups that are quite rational and scientific, to attack anthroposophy. That's probably the right term. And I also see many anthroposophists that they try and what's the English word? They try and find a way to communicate with the outside world in scientific terms, in order to, in a way, to survive. So what I was thinking in terms of what we have been discussing is that, in a way, it seems that the anthroposophical movement has sort of not really gone through that threshold into the integral aspect or pluralistic aspect, at least in its public communicating to the outside world. It's somehow stuck somewhere. So I'm wondering if, I'm just wondering if there's something about also this trying to communicate the mystery in, as you also, Matt, said, maybe it needs to go beyond the Christ-centric, at least, wording. And other aspects. I was also thinking this idea of spiritual science, if that's also a bit I don't know, misleading. So yeah, just questions I think that I have about what I see being in connected to the anthroposophical movement, and wondering how it can move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate those questions. We can keep those alive as we move into the last three. We have 3 more chapters, and the last one is on anthroposophy. And yeah, I'll hold off on sharing more thoughts about the anthroposophical movement at this point and what's going on there. But I resonate with your sense of things. It's unfortunate to hear what's been going on in Sweden with different initiatives, but I don't know if things are so dire on that front in the US. I think there are more schools opening all the time, and Steiner schools or Waldorf schools. But yeah, let's hold those reflections as we move forward. So next week, December 8th, we'll do chapter 6, Modern Idealistic World Concepts. And then on December 15th, chapter 7, Modern Man and His World Concept. And then December 22nd, chapter 8, A Brief Outline of an Approach to Anthroposophy. And then why don't we take a break for Christmas, skip a week, and then get started again in will it be the final week of December for Philosophy of Freedom? Does that sound good? Good trajectory. Great. All right, this was a lot of fun today. Appreciate everyone's thoughts, and I'll share the recording later today.
Thanks, everybody.